Alright guys, so I have cached out our 80 frame. Now one of the things I didn't mention is that in the simulation here underneath the, oops, let's go back to frame 1. In the simulation here, I'm changing the division size back to, instead of 0.1, it's 0.05 now, just to have like, again, 8 times more voxel to represent more detail. Basically, again, the lower this value is, the more detail you will get. So that's gonna take a lot more time to simulate, but I'm now done with caching, and I can just check on load from disk, and now you can see I can really scrub through the timeline and take a look at the simulation result. Alright, so without further delay, let's actually try to do some rendering with it. Just gonna look at this cool angle here, and then I'm gonna holding down Alt and click on the camera to create a camera. Click on the locker to lock it so that I can just zoom out a little bit, maybe position it properly, and turn on the lock. Now I can go to render view and click on render. That's going to allow me to see the actual render results. Now one of the things you are also different than mine is probably like yours is more like this, and you don't have that bar, right? So you can click on this right side bar and then check on this toggle background, toggle transparency. It's going to pre-multiply the alpha on the texture, just like on the actual color information. Basically like a pre-multiplication node in Nuke. So that's going to give you the actual compositing results. Okay, so that's basically the render result now. As you can see, it's not that much different compared to the viewport results. Okay, now a few things we can change here. Now one of the things is how do we use material on this smoke, right? Because now it's not actually having any material on it. So I'm gonna go to the material realm or material land, press tab button and create a pyro material or pyro shader, and I'm gonna call this pyro shader smoke. Okay, now after this material being created, we can go ahead and go back to the object, and we can basically grab this geometry, go to render, go to material, and assign that to whatever inside of this folder, which is basically my cache. So here, go choose pyro shader smoke and accept. And that's gonna allow it to render using the new pyro shader. As you can see, it's different now. And then you can go to the material here and look at this pyro shader and do some tweaking. The first thing you probably can see is that smoke color is basically a middle gray. That's why it's kind of like darker than before. And you can change it to whatever color you want it to be, like a cool blue color or a green color. Don't know which one is. This one is looking pretty cool actually. Alright, so you can change the color like this. Okay. And you can also go change the density, like maybe change it to 10 times denser, and it's gonna make it 10 times denser. So it's not necessarily that you make the density right away and make it perfect in the simulation part, right? You can also dense it in the rendering process and really tweak that again back in the material here. So 10 times denser is probably too much. I'm going to change that back to maybe just twice as dense, just to be able to see a little bit more detail, I guess. Okay, so that's the density here. Now smoke brightness is how bright it is. You can of course make it brighter if you wanted to. Okay, so maybe a little bit brighter is good. Let me change that to maybe 2, just to have some fun with it. Scattering phase, we can talk about that later. And fire is for fire, we don't have that. But down here you have shadow density. And shadow density is how dense the shadow is, or how heavy, how dark the shadow is. If you make that something like 10, you'll see like much darker shadow, which basically preventing lights from going through and make the smoke more opaque. I guess 1 is probably the realistic kind of setting, but of course these kind of things are should be more art directed. So if you want to be heavier, you can probably make it like 1.5 times denser for the shadow density, and you can get more volume basically. So again, it's not oftentimes this is not about realistic kind of like approach. This is more like art directing and trying to figure out the perfect like balance between shadow and brightness and things like that. So it's not always concerning like is it really realistic or not. Okay, cool. So that's some nice rendering we're getting. As you can see, it doesn't take super long. It's 31 seconds to render this image. Okay, so that's basically the general part, and you can go to the smoke field, and we're using this density, and that's what we're using. If you don't want that, you can change it to something else. Basically, you never really want to change it because density is actually the shape you're rendering. But you can actually use its noise. Actually, it's gonna be here. We don't have to change too much here. This is basically clamping the density. Like I don't do too much here, but maybe you can like use lookup ramp, and let's say you want to make those lesser dense part to disappear. You can probably clamp these guys down to 0. As you can see, it's basically clamping and tightening things up, like a remap basically of the density. If you wanted to have tighter and more thin kind of result, you can do this. I turned to like do that in the simulation stage, like to get the shape I want. But I guess if you wanted to, you can just tweak it here too. I mean, whatever works for you, right? Not really saying my way is the best way. I guess those like rendering stage, in the rendering stage you can still do a lot of things here. Okay, the final scale to make it even stronger afterwards. Or you can clamping it. You can fit the range, fit the density to range. And also all sorts of interesting things you can do. Maybe I can just clamp it out just a little bit to get rid of those blurry edge to make it just more readable, I guess. Anyway, let's go back to my noise here. The noise is actually something you can use to add a lot of smaller details. You just need to turn that on. As you can see, it's trying to add noise. And right now it's adding a lot of noise. So here you can actually check on some of the settings here. Like instead of offset it, right, you can make it just a multiplication of the original noise. That way you're getting a result that's closer to the original result. Let's actually wait for this guy to finish rendering. Although it's going to take more time too because it's basically adding more noise. This is not just simply adding noise. We can probably already see the result. If it's easier, let me hold down Shift and drag a rectangular to really tell it to render this part only. Anyway, so let me make it go just a little bit more so that we can see something. I'm recording, so it's like a recording software slowing down my system also. So it's kind of like a little bit lagging. Anyway, hopefully it's not destroying my recording. Anyway, I'm okay with this now, so let me stop that and create a snapshot right here. And I'm gonna go ahead and actually go turn that off and do another render just to compare the difference. As you can see, it's actually much smoother before, and it's also rendering much faster. So yeah, that noise thing basically is slowing down the system. As you can see, this is the noise result, and this is the original result. As you can see, the noise is basically adding a lot of noise to give it a little bit more detail. Okay. So basically, turning that on could help to add more detail. And here, you can basically tell it to be a little bit different underneath the bias, and you can tell it to maybe bias to something smaller, so it's not adding too much detail, but basically just adding a little bit. Oops, actually that's too small. Maybe back to 1. Nah, that feels better. We can still see some detail, and you can also change the final amplitude to maybe 555, so it's basically enhancing again the detail. As you can see, it's now breaking it up with a lot of variation here. Again, these noise are not simply applying noise, it's calculating based on those rest. And so as you can see, this is before, this is after. It's basically using those two rest attributes, rest and rest2, use these two things to calculate the change from the previous frame to the next frame, and then use that to apply a noise that is vecting with the actual smoke movement. So this noise is realistically flowing with the smoke based on again those two rest attributes, and that's why we need these guys. Now how exactly they're working, you don't have to know, just they will automatically read that. So yeah, anyway, so yeah, you can do the tweaking here, you can do some gaining to gain it to make it a little stronger, right? Or yeah, so a lot of tweaking here. I'm not going to go through all the settings possible, but as you can see, with the noise you can add a lot of smaller details. I'm going to go back to not using again, and maybe not that much amplitude, so 222 should be good. Just a little bit variations applied to my smoke. Okay, and again, the size of those details are determined by the frequency. Okay, so that's one of the things you can really enhance, again, the rendering detail on the actual smoke. Let's hold down Shift and double click on the outside to disable that rendering range, and let me just do a final render of the entire image so that we can see how much detail we're getting just from that noise we added. Alright, so the render is done. As you can see, it takes 2 minutes compared to 30 seconds before, just with that noise. And it's basically adding decent amount of detail if you compare to before, right? That's before, and it's after, right? You can see a lot of detail being added, and you can see before it looks really crappy compared to the new ones we added. So I guess it's a good thing to do. It's just slow down the render time, or bring up the render time dramatically. So just be aware of that. I'm gonna go for now, maybe making the noise just a bit weaker. Change that to, instead of 1, maybe 0.6. And also the final amplitude to 1.5, oops. 1.5, so that is not really that dominating, but I still want it. it's just gonna take more time to render. Anyway, let me stop the render now. Okay, so let's say this is basically the things we want to do with the shape changing of the the smoke. We changed the color, we changed the density using the shape and remap it. We added some noise. So in the next one, we're gonna go ahead and maybe toggle and tweak the lighting a little bit, maybe add some cool effect on it. So see you next time.